Hello my viewers and welcome back to my channel. I will come into a shocking expose that dismantles the disturbing trend of denying the transatlantic slave trade's horrific reality. Now in this video, a Hispanic man's viral video attempted to cast doubt on this dark chapter in human history. But today we set the record straight. The numbers are staggering. 12 million souls forcibly transported across the Atlantic, with only 5% arriving in North America. Now this was the largest forced movement of human beings in history. However, some would have you believe that this was logistically impossible, claiming it would take 5,000 years, not 350, to transport such numbers, just like he is saying. But the Black community knows the truth. Denial of the transatlantic slave trade is a disservice to the healing process and disrespect to families who survived the Middle Passage. Now, as we take a look into this critical conversation, we will examine the historical facts and figures, expose the flaws in denialist arguments, explore the motives behind this harmful denial, and amplify the voices of those who demand acknowledgement and reparations. So with that said, let's take a look at his video as my fellow Black brothers and sisters react.
So the transatlantic slave trade managed to transport 12 million people in a span of 350 years, with an average of 400 people per trip, with each trip taking about 2 months, meaning that they would have to transfer around 35,000 people per year in a highly coordinated, constant flow of ships from Africa to North America without error for 350 years, with factors like weather, navigation challenges, ships maintenance and repair. On average, ships lasted 10 to 20 years, mortality rates being 10 to 50% per trip, conflicts and piracy. Only about 70 to 75% of the ships that made that trip ever completed their voyages successfully, meaning that this process was fraught with interruptions and challenges and far from smooth and inefficient. Taking into consideration all these factors would make this process last over 5,000 years. This would mean there would have to be 86 trips per year that went flawlessly. 86 ships carrying 34,000 people, 35,000 people flawlessly. Now, given all the problems that we just went over, this would make the probability of 86 ships flawlessly making it to the Americas from Africa at 0.0000000018%. The probability of maintaining such a perfect success rate is nearly zero. But the transatlantic slave trade managed to transport 12 million people in 350 years flawlessly, when it theoretically would take 5,000 years.
And your point is what? Because you made several implications in your hypothesis. While you're trying to deconstruct and excuse a history that did in fact take place, and I don't give a damn if it was 12 million, 2 million, or 200. The fact of the matter is slavery did take place, and they bred us like we were cattle, and we suffered. So young man, I'm gonna ask you to kindly step back, and play your role. Because obviously, somewhere, your lineage, because you're talking outside of it.
Believe it or not, people are still falling for this denial of the transatlantic slave trade. And interestingly, it's coming around the time of more and more push toward reparations. The number of 12 million he gave is mostly true, except it was probably more than that. Because remember, this was the largest forced movement of human beings in human history. Yet more and more people who are not experts in geography, not experts in maritime history, not even experts in history, are denying it, in spite of the fact that of the 12 million, only 5% ended up in North America. That's why you see the numbers that you do. 95% ended up in South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and otherwise Latin America. Hello? And 45% of those ended up in Brazil alone. Additionally, the primary sources are more valid than his weird math. When you look at slavevoyages.org, and they're just now getting started. They don't even have a small percentage yet because they're still collecting data of all of the maritime records. In addition to that, you have all of the journals and you have all of the memoirs. Primary sources, not just weird math that if you actually look at it won't make sense. And in addition to that, even if you count the black folks who are already here in the Americas, those sent by Mansa Musa and his voyages and other leaders over in West Africa, the numbers will not bear out that this number of people could have resulted from those who ended up in the Western Hemisphere. Where did all those extra Africans come from outside of those who were already here? And moreover, Africans trafficked during the transatlantic slave trade built the economic foundation of all of these Western countries, from Argentina up to Canada, United States, Nicaragua, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, Jamaica, all of these countries. For the most part, they were using manual labor. That could not have been done without the numbers of 12 million plus. Last but not least, he has the term Black history at the top of his video. But with respect to anything related to human beings from West Africa to the Western Hemisphere, that's white history, not black.
Y'all piss me off so damn bad trying to act like it didn't happen. When I know my damn history, I know how my people got here. And the Spanish and the Portuguese captured and sold more slaves than any damn body. People that look like you. Keep your goddamn mouth shut. You act like 35,000 people a year is something. It was actually about 366 years, 12 million people over 366 years. That's about 32,000 people a year. 32,000 people. And the Spanish and the Portuguese were funded by the government, which had military grade cargo ships that could carry at least 700 slaves, which means it'll be about 46 trips a year. And if it's 10 dips doing that, that's only one trip a season. Find you somebody to play with.
I know it's atrocious to think that your people, the Ashkenazi, and the Europeans, all of the Europeans, and all Central, South, and North America had a hand in it. As you said, North America, no, Mexico had a hand in it. Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, all of them had a hand in it. All of Europe, and they were funded, operated, and insured by the Ashkenazi while Europe built the ships. So yeah, about 350 years, moved 12 million people, us, the Hebrew Israelites, the children of God, to this hemisphere. And it's funny that you Hispanics are so racist, you're trying to dispute that this happened. Don't worry, Yahuwah remembers, the Most High remembers, and the Bible predicted it. Take care of yourself, your kingdom is crumbling, and everything you people did to us, you will pay for. Shalom.
Yes, it did. Now, no hate to this original creator, but I feel like it's really important to address this issue whenever it pops up. Just like denialism of the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide or the horrors of the residential school system, people who deny the transatlantic slave trade and the very real trauma that is associated with it are doing a serious disservice to the healing that needs to take place over this entire process, and are disrespecting people whose families have very real stories of surviving the Middle Passage and all of the things that followed suit. So for the uninitiated, the transatlantic slave trade was part of what's called the triangular trade, and this brought people to the Americas. So this is not just the United States, but also to Canada, to the Caribbean, to Mexico, to Central America and South America. And there, you would have the manufacturing of goods like cotton, tobacco, sugar, etc. And then those raw materials would then be sent up to Europe, where they would be turned into things, where they would be brought back to West Africa, and they would be traded for more slaves. And this was a trade that lasted for around 350 years and required a lot of manpower. And this was big business. A lot of the major empires were involved. We're talking about Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, even Latvia took a crack at it. My mother's country, or my mother's island, was like a colony of Latvia for like a little while for some reason. But anyway, This was big business. And so with big business, you're going to have a lot of people who are interested. You'll have people who are contractors or privateers whose job it is to do that on behalf of businesses. There are businesses who will be doing it themselves with their own ships. You have ships that are mandated by the king to ensure that there are certain numbers of people that are brought over a period of time. So this was not a small endeavor. In fact, the first slaves to arrive in the Americas from Africa numbered about 4,000, I believe it was. And these were brought from the west coast of Africa to the Spanish colony in Jamaica, who ended up running away and living with the Taino. Good for them. But they had the capacity to transport a lot of people very quickly with a lot of ships. And moving 12 million people in the course of 350 years by ship was absolutely doable. And this is including if we factor in all of the things that were mentioned, like storms and maintenance and people on the ships and jumping overboard or people getting thrown overboard because people want to get insurance payments and all of that. We also have to consider the fact that there were people who were transported illicitly, illegally, or without licenses. So there were people who would just people and then ship them over without being connected to another company. And then they would just bring them to a major trade hub, say, for example, Bridgetown in Barbados, where they would just get mixed in with the population, they would take their profit, and they would go on and do it again. And this is a thing that happened. I mean, 12 million is the low end figure. That is what they can account for, but chances are the number was much higher. But since the math was not mathing, let's do some together. So we're talking about 12 million people. We'll go with that figure over the course of 300 years. So we're talking about 1500 to about 1850. Okay? We'll work with that. So now we're looking at about 34,285 people plus change in a year. So maybe that might be a ship that may not be totally full and is bringing a few people. Okay, we'll go with that. So let's say, for example, the average ship carries about 450 people. And we do have to understand that not all ships carried this many people. Some carried more, some carried fewer. And then as time went on, especially after the trade was made illegal, or at least the transport was made illegal, there were fewer ships. And at the very beginning, there were fewer ships. But if the Spanish were able to bring 4,000 people in the first year of enslaving people, that should tell you enough. So anyway, so we get this 34,000 people divided by about 450 people per ship. So what we get now is about 76 successful trips a year. 76 successful trips in a year. And a ship usually takes about 3 months to get from one point to another. 76 ships a year, average, over 350 years, was absolutely doable. In the beginning, of course, there were fewer ships. People were traveling on smaller ships. But when the trade really picked up, especially at the peak of it in the 18th century, you had hundreds of ships a year going from one place to another, transporting people, tobacco, slaves, sugar, what have you. And it's really important that we respect the fact that this happened, because much of what our society looks like today is rooted in the wealth that was gained as a result of that trade. Now, if you're interested in learning a bit more, you can check out Olaide Equiano's memoir. He actually wrote this in the late 18th century about his experience being trafficked from Benin to the Caribbean and then later on to the United States, up until, of course, he got his freedom. And it was a major piece of the strategy for abolitionists in England who were trying to put an end to the trade. I also recommend checking out the Smithsonian Slave Wrecks Project, where they actually travel around finding the places where the slave ships sank and finding out the stories of all of the people who ended up not making it across the sea.
I present to you Pangea. Look at this one would do. You most, pull out my pen, most black Americans, when they check their DNA, it comes from somewhere around this area, right? That would make you real close to this area and this area, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? Okay. Right. That would really put you close to all these areas, wouldn't it? Okay, good luck with that information.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this one. Wait, a Hispanic man thought he could just dismiss the transatlantic slave trade with a simplistic video. Wow. I feel it's an insult to the struggles and hardships endured by Black people. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly displaced over 12 million Africans, with estimates suggesting many more. The trauma, suffering, and generations-long impact are well documented. Does he not understand the gravity of this history? It's staggering to think that someone would so blatantly deny the severity of this issue. So why would a Hispanic man engage in such denialism? I can only wonder, is it ignorance or intentional distortion? Does he not recognize the shared experiences of oppression between Black and brown communities? Now, some possible motivations come to mind. Perhaps it's a lack of education on the subject, an attempt to downplay historical injustices, or an effort to deflect attention from systemic racism. Whatever the reason is, it's unacceptable. Denying the transatlantic slave trade's severity is a disservice to the millions who suffered, the families torn apart, the cultures erased, and the ongoing struggle for justice. We need to be clear here. Work is far from over, and people must educate themselves and amplify marginalized voices, confront systemic racism, and honor the memories of those who endured. Now, when we look at the transatlantic slave voyages over the period of the Atlantic slave trade from approximately 1526 to 1867, some 12.5 million captured men, women, and children were put on ships in Africa, and 10.7 million arrived in the Americas. Now, the Atlantic slave trade was likely the most costly in human life of all long-distance global migrations. The first Africans forced to work in the New World left from Europe at the beginning of the 16th century, not from Africa. The first voyage carrying enslaved people direct from Africa to the Americas probably sailed in 1526. Now, the number of people carried off from Africa reached 30,000 per year in the 1690s and 85,000 per year a century later. More than 8 out of 10 Africans forced into the slave trade crossed the Atlantic between 1700 and 1850. The decade 1821 to 1830 saw more than 80,000 people a year leaving Africa in slave ships. Well, over 1 million more, 1/10 of those carried off in the slave trade era, followed within the next 20 years. By 1820, nearly 4 Africans for every 1 European had crossed the Atlantic. About 4 out of every 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were from Africa. Now, the majority of enslaved Africans brought to British North America arrived between 1720 and 1780. Africans carried to Brazil came overwhelmingly from Angola. Africans carried to North America, including the Caribbean, left mainly from West Africa. Over 90% of enslaved Africans were sent to the Caribbean and South America. Only about 6% of African captives were sent directly to British North America. Yet by 1825, the U.S. population included about 1/4 of the people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Middle Passage was dangerous and horrific. The genders were separated. Men, women, and children were kept naked, packed close together, and the men were chained for long periods. About 12% of those who embarked did not survive the voyage. Denying the transatlantic slave trade is an outrageous disservice to the millions who suffered, families torn apart, cultures erased, and the ongoing struggle for justice. It's appalling that whenever Black people seek acknowledgement and reparations, attempts to erase history emerge. Like, why do people think Black lives are expendable and their experiences insignificant? The audacity to question the feasibility of the transatlantic slave trade solely because it happened to Black people is staggering. It's not about possibility, it's about accountability. We must confront the past, honor the victims, and fight for justice. This man's disturbing claims dismissing the transatlantic slave trade's severity demonstrates a shocking disregard for historical facts. His arguments demand a correction. Firstly, he claimed it's logistically impossible to transport 12 million people. However, historical records confirm the transatlantic slave trade lasted over 350 years, with approximately 12 to 15 million Africans forcibly displaced through a complex network of slave forts, ships, and trading routes. Now, another misconception he peddled was that the journey was too long and treacherous for slaves to survive. While mortality rates were indeed high, millions of enslaved Africans did survive the Middle Passage. Estimates suggest that 10 to 20% of captives got unalive during transport, but this doesn't diminish the brutality and scale of the trade. Now, he also pointed out that only 5% of slaves ended up in North America, which, although true, lacks context. This 5% represents hundreds of thousands of lives impacted in North America alone. Now, the transatlantic slave trade's reach was global, affecting millions more in the Caribbean, South America, and Europe. He also attempted to normalize the transatlantic slave trade as part of history. However, this was a systematized race-based atrocity, unparalleled in scale and brutality. Its legacy continues to impact communities today. Now, denying or downplaying the transatlantic slave trade's horrors is unacceptable. We must acknowledge the facts, honor the victims, and confront the ongoing impacts of systemic racism. To this Hispanic man and others spreading misinformation, I would tell them to educate themselves first and respect Black communities' experiences. Please do so. We have finally come to the end of the video, but what do you have to say? Share your thoughts, your views, your take on this in the comment section. Thank you for always watching, and see you in my next video as I bring you another video.